Don't keep me long, that's all." So saying, Sir Mulberry took up his hat, and humming a fragment of a song, disappeared through the door of communication between the two drawing rooms, and closed it after him. "Now, my lord," said Ralph, "what is it?" "Nickleby," said his client, throwing himself along the sofa on which he had been previously seated, so as to bring his lips nearer to the old man's ear, "what a pretty creature your niece is!" "Is she, my lord?" replied Ralph. "Maybe, maybe. I don't trouble my head with such matters." "You know she's a deyvlish fine girl," said the client. "You must know that, Nickleby. Come, don't deny that." "Yes, I believe she is considered so," replied Ralph. "Indeed, I know she is. If I did not, you are an authority on such points, and your taste, my lord, on all points, indeed, is undeniable." Nobody but the young man to whom these words were addressed could have been deaf to the sneering tone in which they were spoken, or blind to the look of contempt by which they were accompanied. But Lord Frederick Verisopht was both, and took them to be complimentary. "Well," he said, "perhaps you're a little right, and perhaps you're a little wrong. A little of both, Nickleby. I want to know where this beauty lives, that I may have another peep at her, Nickleby." "Really," Ralph began in his usual tones. "Don't talk so loud," cried the other, achieving the great point of his lesson to a miracle. "I don't want Hawk to hear." "You know he's your rival, do you?" said Ralph, looking sharply at him. "He always is, damn him," replied the client, "and I want to steal a march upon him. Ha, ha, ha! He'll cut up so rough, Nickleby, at our talking together without him. Where does she live, Nickleby? That's all. Only tell me where she lives, Nickleby." "He bites," thought Ralph. "He bites." "Eh, Nickleby, eh?" pursued the client. "Where does she live?" "Really, my lord," said Ralph, rubbing his hands slowly over each other, "I must think before I tell you." "No, not a bit of it, Nickleby. You mustn't think at all," replied Verisopht. "Where is it?" "No good can come of your knowing," replied Ralph. "She's been virtuously and well brought up. To be sure, she's handsome, poor, unprotected. Poor girl, poor girl." Ralph ran over this brief summary of Kate's condition as if it were merely passing through his own mind, and he had no intention to speak aloud. But the shrewd, sly look which he directed at his companion as he delivered it, gave this poor assumption the lie. "I tell you I only want to see her," cried his client. "A man may look at a pretty woman without harm, mayn't he? Now, where DOES she live? You know you're making a fortune out of me, Nickleby, and upon my soul nobody shall ever take me to anybody else, if you only tell me this." "As you promise that, my lord," said Ralph, with feigned reluctance, "and as I am most anxious to oblige you, and as there's no harm in it, no harm, I'll tell you. But you had better keep it to yourself, my lord. Strictly to yourself." Ralph pointed to the adjoining room as he spoke, and nodded expressively. The young lord, feigning to be equally impressed with the necessity of this precaution, Ralph disclosed the present address and occupation of his niece, observing that, from what he heard of the family, they appeared very ambitious to have distinguished acquaintances, and that a lord could doubtless introduce himself with great ease, if he felt disposed. "Your object being only to see her again," said Ralph, "you could effect it at any time you chose by that means." Lord Verisopht acknowledged the hint with a great many squeezes of Ralph's hard horny hand, and whispering that they would now do well to close the conversation, called to Sir Mulberry Hawk that he might come back. "I thought you'd gone to sleep," said Sir Mulberry, reappearing with an ill-tempered air. "Sorry to detain you," replied the gull, "but Nickleby has been so amazingly funny that I couldn't tear myself away." No, no,' said Ralph, 'it was all his lordship. You know what a witty, humorous, elegant, accomplished man Lord Frederick is. Mind the step, my lord. Sir Mulberry, pray give way.' With such courtesies as these, and many low bows, and the same cold sneer upon his face all the while, Ralph busied himself in showing his visitors downstairs, and, otherwise than by the slightest possible motion about the corners of his mouth, returned no show of answer to the look of admiration with which Sir Mulberry Hawk seemed to compliment him on being such an accomplished and most consummate scoundrel. There had been a ring at the bell, a few minutes before, which was answered by Newman Noggs just as they reached the hall. In the ordinary course of business, Newman would have either admitted the newcomer in silence, or have requested him or her to stand aside while the gentleman passed out. But he no sooner saw who it was, than, as if for some private reason of his own, he boldly departed from the established custom of Ralph's mansion in business hours, and looking towards the respectable trio who were approaching, cried, in a loud and sonorous voice, 'Mrs. Nickleby!' 'Mrs. Nickleby!' cried Sir Mulberry Hawk, as his friend looked back and stared him in the face. It was indeed that well-intentioned lady, who, having received an offer for the empty house in the city directed to the landlord, had brought it post haste to Mr. Nickleby without delay. 'Nobody you know,' said Ralph. 'Step into the office, my dear. I'll be with you directly.' 'Nobody I know!' cried Sir Mulberry Hawk, advancing to the astonished lady. 'Is this Mrs. Nickleby, the mother of Miss Nickleby, the delightful creature I had the happiness of meeting in this house the very last time I dined here? But no,' said Sir Mulberry, stopping short. 'No, it can't be. There's the same cast of features, the same indescribable air of no, no. This lady is too young for that.' 'I think you can tell the gentleman, brother-in-law, if it concerns him to know,' said Mrs. Nickleby, acknowledging the compliment with a graceful bend, 'that Kate Nickleby is my daughter.' 'Her daughter, my lord!' cried Sir Mulberry, turning to his friend. 'This lady's daughter, my lord!' 'My lord!' thought Mrs. Nickleby. 'Well, I never did.' 'This, then, my lord,' said Sir Mulberry, 'is the lady to whose obliging marriage we owe so much happiness. This lady is the mother of sweet Miss Nickleby. Do you observe the extraordinary likeness, my lord? Nickleby, introduce us.' Ralph did so in a kind of desperation. ''Pon my soul, it's a most delightful thing,' said Lord Frederick, pressing forward. 'How-de-do?' Mrs. Nickleby was too much flurried by these uncommonly kind salutations, and her regrets at not having on her other bonnet, to make any immediate reply, so she merely continued to bend and smile, and betray great agitation. 'And how is Miss Nickleby?' said Lord Frederick. 'Well, I hope?' 'She's quite well, I'm obliged to you, my lord,' returned Mrs. Nickleby, recovering. 'Quite well. She wasn't well for some days after that day she dined here, and I can't help thinking that she caught cold in that hackney coach coming home. Hackney coaches, my lord, are such nasty things, that it's almost better to walk at any time; for although I believe a hackney coachman can be transported for life if he has a broken window, still they are so reckless that they nearly all have broken windows. I once had a swelled face for 6 weeks, my lord, from riding in a hackney coach. I think it was a hackney coach,' said Mrs. Nickleby, reflecting, 'although I'm not quite certain whether it wasn't a chariot. At all events, I know it was a dark green, with a very long number, beginning with an 'ort and ending with a 9. No, beginning with a 9 and ending with a 0. That was it. And, of course, the Stamp Office people would know at once whether it was a coach or a chariot if any inquiries were made there. However that was, there it was with a broken window, and there was I for 6 weeks with a swelled face. I think that was the very same hackney coach that we found out afterwards had the top open all the time, and we should never even have known it if they hadn't charged us a shilling an hour extra for having it open, which it seems is the law, or was then, and a most shameful law it appears to be. I don't understand the subject, but I should say the corn laws